Good morning and welcome back. I just want to spend a minute to remind us of what we did last time. Basically, we were looking at the underlining or underpinnings or the fundamentals of assessment, things kind of gnarly things like reliability and validity and assessment tools and all that, just to kind of get everyone on the same page in terms of our baseline knowledge of assessment. And so what we're going to do today is going to review the questions that were left in the chat box following the last session. We're going to look at the domains of assessment. What are some of the areas that we test, and what are some of the tests that do those assess those domains? We're going to look at the types of assessments because particularly the students we're interested in, we're going to be when we talk about the cross-battery assessment process, where we're going to find out that a lot of times we're developing a hypothesis about what we think is going on, and then we go down the road and start providing our instruction or interventions or whatever it might be, and we want to make sure we're on track. So there's some other assessments that we need to continue using as part of the comprehensive eval to make sure that the answers that we came up with following that evaluation we're on track. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually look at the cross-battery assessment process. It's a process that's been around for a long time, that's been in use for the population that we're talking about, low incidence population, kids who are typically not included in the norming sample of a lot of norm reference assessments. I do want to mention that even though it's been in use for quite a while for our population, this is going to be extremely important for what's coming down the road in terms of the change in learning disabilities identification. So if you're a special educator who supports children with learning disabilities as well, this cross-battery assessment is essential, because that's how we're going to be responding in the future. So, for example, the questions are going to be very different in the new world order that I'm referring to as starting in next school year, when we no longer have the discrepancy model, that model whereby you might assess the youngster's cognitive abilities, assess their achievement, and if there's a big enough difference between the two, a discrepancy, we suggest that is indicative of learning disability. That's no longer going to be available to us. And so questions are going to be different. In an RTI model, the question is going to be, has Elwood been provided with evidence-based instruction in the 5 areas? So for example, if we're looking at reading, the 5 areas of reading within the general ed setting, if the answer is yes, then our next question is has Elwood been provided with evidence-based supplemental services? And this is kind of simplifying the model, that have resulted in growth. If the answer is no to that, then the question is, why not? And that's when we have to start figuring out what tests are we going to use to find out what's going on here. So for example, in this, if we keep going with this reading example, the person who's providing supplemental services shares during the team meeting that, Elwood seems to have it on Monday, but not on Tuesday. The question becomes, why doesn't Elwood remember the skills, or why can't Elwood perform the skills that he had on Monday on Tuesday? And that's where your psychologist, your other assessment people come in and say, okay, here's some things. And now we're going to look at, now we're looking at, short-term memory, long-term retrieval, things like that. We're not necessarily doing a huge evaluation. We're trying to pinpoint, so they're more targeted. We're trying to pinpoint what's going on with the youngster. Similar questions are going to happen if you go with a strengths and weaknesses model, or pattern of strengths and weaknesses model. We're going to be asking, are there any cognitive skills that are challenging for this youngster that are related to one of the basic skill areas? And again, we're going to need to know what tests are there. So this cross-battery assessment is going to be pervasive across education starting next year. I've pulled together some resources that we're going to get to you during today's, and took a look at some of the tests that you're commonly exposed to. There are thousands of tests out there. So what I did was I looked at some of the most common ones that you're going to see, and I've developed some forms, that worksheets that tell what they test and how they test it. And we're going to ask you folks to take a peek at those, and we have some scenarios for you with youngsters who might present a challenge to evaluation process, what kind of modifications or adaptations might we make to the testing situation, and which tests might fit. So we'll kind of give you a chance to do that, and then come back and tell us what you found. Finally, during the end of the day, if we have time, we're going to talk about reporting out. How do we share these results with parents? So the biggest thing is when we're done with one of our evaluations is to be able to ensure parents that, hey, we have a pretty good idea what's going on with your child, and we know what to do. That's how we have happy families and good relationships, when we can feel confident in indicating we've got this, and we're gonna do our best to instill growth there. And then lastly, in the other subsequent sessions, we're gonna have case studies and support. And one of the things I wanted to mention before I forget it, when we go into this activity where you're looking at the test analysis and thinking about a scenario, if you get a scenario and you're in a group, but you're about to evaluate or go into an evaluation of a youngster who might be challenging to, if your group agrees, you can jettison the scenario and work on your real youngster and see what you come out with that. Okay. So that's not gonna sound like a reasonable way to spend the morning, the afternoon. All right, here we go. So here we go. So here are some of the questions. I'm going to respond to the questions that came up. And so one of the questions or statement was, the number of areas to be assessed seems overwhelming. Any tips? And I'm going to call that's my bad. I thought about how I had labeled this slide, so I created a new slide. And it used to say, what do we assess? And this is now says, what should we consider in an evaluation plan? So I may have presented this in a way that suggested that we had to assess all these areas, and that's not the case. We have to consider these areas. And so for you folks for example, on physical characteristics, you have a lot of folks who might have some challenges in these areas. So we have to look at these. But even other situations. So just this week, I was in an educational planning team meeting, and in those meetings, as a psychologist, I tend to sit back and listen. I want to hear what everyone has to say, and I take notes and all of that. And this was a young gal, third grader, who's struggling with basic reading skills. Otherwise, things are going pretty good, it seems. However, during the conversation, Mom shared that she's coming home every night with headaches. For me, that threw up a red flag. So we started asking the question, and anyway, so we have scheduled a vision exam, and they're also going to do a hearing exam. So that may not be the case. So, for example, the youngsters that you're talking about, well, we don't have it. Youngsters well behaved. We don't have any issues with self-control. We don't have to look at that. So these are just here because the feds want to remind us that we have to take a holistic view, that our youngsters don't come through the door and leave issues behind. One of the thing is we talk about is relevant life circumstances. It's very common for me to get an evaluation for a youngster for an attentional disorder, and start doing a record review, and there's really kids in the 5th grade. Nothing was said by the elementary school teachers, kindergarten. There's no little red flags when I do the record reviews and look. And then I find out that Dad moved out 6 months ago. And that's when this problem arose. So that's a huge piece of information to have that suggests that this youngster is responding probably to that and not necessarily an attentional disorder. But anyway, just keeping in mind, just to clarify this, we need to consider these, but we do not need to assess each one of them. It's only if someone on the team thinks that this is an area of concern. Okay. All right. Next question that came up was, when does an accommodation make a test invalid? Well, the simple answer is when the accommodation changes what is being assessed. So, for example, if you have a reading comprehension test and you have a youngster who and has difficulty reading, and you have someone read it to the person, and then they respond to, say, 4 multiple choice comprehension questions that are there. So what's happened now, that accommodation has changed that from a reading comprehension test to a listening comprehension test. And that might be a good thing, because if he does well, we know that this youngster has good listening comprehension skills. A way to accommodate that might be is that we do ask the student to read it, but suppose that they have some articulation issues or some communication issues. We might allow them to point to which answer is appropriate. We might Xerox the page, cut out the answers, and let him pick up or select the answer that he thinks is appropriate. And that would not change the test. So the short answer is, if the accommodation does not change what's being measured, then we're in a good place. And we're going to talk about this a little later. There were 4 general types of accommodations, and they are how we present the information, how we expect the student to respond, the setting in which the assessments are administered, and also timing issues related to that. So we'll look at all those 4 to see what accommodations might be appropriate. Okay. All righty. The next question was, there was a time frame required by adult services regarding how recent the intelligence testing needs to have occurred. This is a great question, because I've seen this in my practice. I think I talked about last time about regulatory myth. I've been told by people, special educators, that they've been told by representatives of adult services that the assessments, particularly a cognitive assessment, needs to be within a year old, within a year. And so when we look at the actual rules and regulations, it's fairly interesting what they say. They say it's the responsibility of the psychologist to decide whether new cognitive testing is needed. So that's really important. I think we have to keep in mind that every one of us, when we go to bed tonight, our brains are going to be different from when we woke up this morning. We're creating new synapses and new connections, and we're also pruning ones we don't use. Well, the same is true of every student that we work with. So if we have a student who hasn't had a cognitive test in 3, 4, 5 years, we really behooves us to do that, because their brain has changed as a result of being on the planet and experiencing the world around them. So there's a good chance we're going to see some differences. However, on the other side, if a youngster has been, a youth or a young person has been evaluated, say, in the 10th grade, and you got a pretty good handle, it's consistent with all prior evaluations, the youngster wouldn't need an evaluation until they graduated, or let's assume they're leaving it to 12th grade, or and moving on to adult services. It may not be necessary to do that if that's quiet. And the rules tell us here that in general, for school age children, current means conducted within the past 3 years. That's consistent with special ed regs. But for adults, which we're talking about high school students, current means cognitive testing conducting late in adolescence or adulthood. And so there's no 1 hour time frame here. It's just whether or not it happened while they were in high school. And lastly, it says that if the psychologist determines that a lot of this lays on the psychologist. So I want to impart that the psychologist is part of your team. The psychologist is not in charge of the team, is not the team leader. He or she is an equal member of the educational planning team. So what this is really saying is it's the responsibility of the educational planning team to decide whether new. And so with the input from the psychologist. So if the psychologist determines that the standardized intellectual test is inappropriate, and that can happen. I've read reviews, I've read reports where during the prior evaluation, the youngster was hostile and aggressive, and things didn't go well, and we didn't get really good results. We might be in a place now where the youngster is the youth is more open to assessment, and the psychologist might say, it's probably a good idea to see if we can get some more current behavior, current measures of their, whatever it is we're measuring, their cognitive behavior, their academic skills, their adaptive functioning, whatever. So just to recap, there is not as has been said to me on numerous occasions, a 1 year requirement for these tests, so that it has to, if you're working in high schools, transitioning to adult services, if you have had one while the youngster was in high school, that will suffice if the team decides we're happy with that data. If the teams decide that's not really representative of this youngster, or boy, this youngster has made significant growth over the past couple of years, we think we should do this, so we send them off to his next environment with some more accurate data. Again, it's a team decision. Okay. All right. Another question was, will the Vermont Agency of Education monitoring team be looking to see if we're reporting the standard error measurement? I contacted the special ed hotline where you leave a message and someone gets back to you, and no one got back to me. So I don't have the official answer to that. I will say that Vermont special education regulations indicate that the educational planning team must consider the standard error measurement when reporting scores. And to me, that suggests that if you're reporting scores in a written report, then you need to include that. That's my opinion, the standard error measurement. I think I mentioned too that Art Sinozia, who is an attorney that some of you may be familiar with, who's an incredible advocate for kids with special education needs, has indicated that case law has proven this to be the case too, that you have to consider the standard error measurement. All right. So I think those are all the questions that were posted, and hopefully we've got them all covered. Just to kind of remind us, where the folks we're talking about today are students with complex profiles, and also known as low incidence. When I was in graduate school, it's low incidence populations. And again, another reminder that with the changing landscape of learning disability identification, the stuff we're going to be talking about last session and today applies to all special ed situations. It's really important for kids with low incidence populations because they're not included in most norm samples. So we have to be creative in assessing their strengths and challenges. But starting next year, the educational planning team is going to need to consider a different way about asking questions and assessing kids. And I just want to, you should be relying on your psychologists and your assessment people to do that. But I'm going to provide you with some resources so that you can support and help them and be part of the conversation as well. And you'll have those to take with you at the end of the day. All right. So there was a question that I wasn't quite sure what they were getting at. They wanted to know if I could say more about developmental scores. And I wasn't quite sure what more to say, except that developmental scores, and what we're talking about is age and grade equivalent scores. They're yucky scores. That's a really technical term, because what it does, it just represents the raw score, that the number you got on a particular test, and then they compare that. Okay, how old was the average person who got 8 of these right? And that becomes your age equivalent. Or what grade was the average student who got the same night? That becomes your right. That becomes your grade equivalent. But if you recall, I showed you some charts that came from real manuals that showed that by getting one more item right, you frequently can jump up in an age equivalent score to a whole grade level, and vice versa. You get one more wrong, and you can drop down a whole. So they're not really reflective. I also showed an example whereby you had 2 people with the same grade equivalent scores, but one of them had significantly better and more advanced math skills than the other, but they both still ended up with the same grade equivalent score. And then lastly, and I think the most important, based relative to the population we're talking about today, is I've seen reports that come back from folks that say that this 12-year-old individual is functioning on a 5-year-old level of XYZ skill, which is ridiculous, because the youngster been on this planet a long period of time, and there are other things that are going on, but besides that one score, that score tells us nothing. It's not helpful at all. What's more helpful is if the person does an item analysis and says, Elwood was able to do X, Y, Z on this assessment, and then makes a recommendation. In order to progress in this domain, it would be essential for Elwood to be able to do ABC. We make some recommendations about how do we get this developmental trajectory going in the right direction. That score does nothing to help the educational planning team. Because remember, we said, it's the different reasons why we do these evaluations. One is for eligibility. Well, these youngsters are often eligible without any challenge there, but also to inform instruction and to program development. And being told that a 12-year-old is functioning at a 5-year-old level does nothing to help us with that. And I would suggest that if you get a report that says that, you send it back and say, no, that's not helpful. You need to tell us what this youngster can do and what your recommendations are in terms of where do we go next. And you might even want to say that from the outset. Say, we're not interested in these types of scores. If you're working with someone who has traditionally provided those scores, you tell them what exactly it is you're looking for. As I mentioned in the first session, the reports you get back from contracted evaluators are only as good as the questions that you posed. All right. I'd hope
So Rich,
Yep.
Joy Wilcox posted an article entitled "Why Age and Grade Scores Should Never Be Used," and she put that in the chat for everyone.
Was that written by the National Association of Teachers of Readers? Joy, I'm just wondering. The National Association of Reading Teachers, or?
No, anyway, I don't think so.
Because they put out a position paper against it as well. Well, thank you, Joy, and hope people download that and hope it supports what I'm saying, because
it does.
They're yucky scores.
So it's written by Jim Persinger, and as part of a newsletter of the Kansas Association of School Psychologists, is what it says at the bottom of the article.
The National Association is an organization. I don't know the exact acronym, but it's the National Association of Reading Teachers. They came out with a position paper a long time ago saying never use these age and grade equivalent, these developmental scores. So people are on the same page, and we don't want these things. Okay. Thank you, Joy, for the support and for the reference as well. I'm going to download that as well. All righty. Am I good, Mary Ellen? Any other questions that I might have missed, or?
Not so far.
Okay. So just want to start talking about the domains of that we're going to be looking at, and one of them is cognitive skills. It's an essential part for currently for learning disabilities. However, we now know that our cognitive, we've known it all along, but now we have detailed information that our cognitive skills influence our academic performance, and that's what this is all about. And so, there's no real agreement. The feds not too long ago paid for all these famous high-paid people to come to DC and come up with a definition of intelligence. They couldn't do it. The best they could agree on was it's the ability to learn and problem solve. So there's no consensus on that. However, intelligence is not something we can lick or touch or put our finger on, and so it's a construct or a theory. And so I want to mention that over the past 5 to 10 years, every cognitive test that has been published with the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory of cognitive abilities as its foundation. And so this is what that looks like. What that theory says is that when we're alive and breathing and we're engaged in any kind of cognitive activity, we have this general intelligence at play. But depending on what we're doing, some other skills come into play. So for example, right now you're doing auditory processing. And so because I'm talking and you're listening, but you also might be taking notes. So you got short-term working memory going on. So these don't necessarily work in isolation. They, depending on the task, you might have a number of these working at the same time. And so this is, I just put up this little graphic because this represents and I'm not endorsing a singular test right now, but the Woodcock-Johnson test of cognitive abilities measures more of the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory than any other cognitive test. So this green represents 7 cognitive skills that you need to be successful on this planet and in school. And so the Stanford Binet measures 5. The Wechsler scales measures 5. And so, but then down below each one, there are different other kinds. So long-term retrieval is just not one thing. There are different kinds of long-term retrieval. You have the colored boxes, and then below you have the white boxes with the gray outlines. There are actually about, at this point, I think between 80 and 85 of those have been discovered in terms of, so these are narrow cognitive abilities. And so on the long-term retrieval, that's a broad ability. Long-term retrieval is my ability to pull information out of my brain that I have in there. But a narrow ability is how quickly can I do that? If I'm fast at doing that, then I'm a quick problem solver and I get through my work. If I'm slow at that, that can create a whole host of problems for me. So anyway, what this graphic does, it just represents what the Woodcock-Johnson measures. It measures these 7 broad areas, and then it also, anything below it, it measures those narrow areas. And so that helps us figure out a little more detail what might be going on with a student. Now, I have some other tests measure different things, and I'm going to give you some resources to look at those. I just want to point out on the left here, you have reading, writing, quantitative knowledge, and domain-specific knowledge like science and all that. Well, those are actually have been found to be, those are cognitive skills as well. We just call them academic skills. And so if you look here, these are some of the things that are the narrow abilities under those. So just to kind of recap, it's a theory of intelligence that says that overall, we've got a number of things happening when we're engaged in any kind of conscious activity. And depending on the activity, one or more of these broad abilities, fluid reasoning, comprehension, knowledge, are going to be at play. And depending on the activity, we might have a narrow ability. Now, we also know that each one of these green areas has an influence on our academic achievement. And that's one of the reasons why we're so interested in the cognitive piece. So for our students, we want to find out, are there any relative strengths or significant strengths in any of these areas, or any significant challenges that are getting in the way of other things? If you think, just to kind of throw in some of the RTI and the patterns of strength and weakness, we're gonna be asking the question: does this youngster have a pattern of a weakness in a cognitive area? So for example, let's look at auditory processing. Do they have a pattern of a weakness in an auditory processing and a pattern and a weakness in that academic area that is associated or requires auditory processing? And that area is reading. It's essential to have auditory processing skills to become a good reader. So now what we're doing is we're saying, hey, wait a minute, a pattern is showing up that I have a weakness in this area, and now I have a matching weakness. So I don't have the cognitive horsepower necessary to become a good reader because my auditory processing skills are so deficit. When I look at reading, I have reading deficits. So it's no longer a discrepancy model. We're looking for patterns that match. So there's a pattern of weakness, and then we have a pattern of weakness that shows up over on the left in the reading piece. So just to kind of give you a quick example how that's going to play out in other areas of eligibility. I just want to mention some tests that are commonly used out there. Our subsequent times together, if you want to get into more detail of some of these, as I've already stated, no tests to create all tests are not created equal. We have to think about reliability and validity. And so we have, these are some of the most common cognitive ability tests you're going to come into contact with. Now, remember what I said about reliability and validity. If we're making decisions, life-changing decisions about people, the reliabilities of these tests that you use have to be 0.9 or above. Remember we said if you square the reliability, 9 times 9 is 81. So that means even if it's a 0.9, which is an excellent test, 81% of the score represents what you're measuring, and 19% is some other thing that we're not quite sure, or we may know what it is, but it's some other variable that's not, it's not what you're measuring. So there's no perfect test of any ability that we're measuring. Okay. Now, having said that, remember we said that our young people are often frequently not in the norm sample. And so we've already determined that because of because they have cerebral palsy, that they're eligible for special ed services. So now we can lower the bar a little bit in terms of reliability, because of two things. One is that it's not we're using these now to identify patterns of strengths or cognitive strengths in individuals that we can tap into to provide instruction. And so that's not a life-altering decision. And so we're able to use tests that have reliabilities of say 0.8 or above. We're never going to want to use a test that has a reliability of below 0.8, but at 0.8 or above. Okay. The second reason is, and I alluded to earlier, we're not done. So this comprehensive evaluation is a dynamic, ongoing thing. So we've done the evaluation, we've accommodated some tests, we've come up with some data, we have a theory about our youngster, and we have a hypothesis we developed, and this is the road we're going to go. But we're not 100% sure we hit it. So we're going to have to monitor. So later on, we're going to talk about progress monitoring, but we're going to have to monitor the youngster's response to our instruction to be sure that we've hit the mark, because we're using tests that aren't quite as reliable as we would like. And but otherwise we wouldn't be able to get that information. So it's one of those times where it's okay for us to deviate from that 0.9 piece, because what we're going to do is going to follow up afterwards to make sure we're on the right track. We're just not going to go down this road and then a year later take a peek and say, it didn't work, or it did work. We're going to be monitoring as we go along. Does that make sense to folks, I hope? All righty. Here's some questions that we might ask during the eval plan meeting that we want to then transmit to whoever's doing the work. What is Elwood's overall level of cognitive function? Now, we may not be able to get that, but I think it's always good to put that out there. However, we may decide that we can't administer an entire test and get a score. And so that's important from the outset. When I'm involved in these kinds of cross-battery assessments, one of the things I let the parents and the team know right from the get-go is that we may not get that big score that people like. We call it an IQ or a GIA or a comprehension cluster score or something. But we're going to get information about what the youngster's strengths or weaknesses are. But we're going to ask this question just again. Okay, we are going to ask, does Elwood demonstrate any significant or relative strengths within this cognitive profile? And the reason I phrase it that way is that some of the students that we're going to assess, all their scores may end up falling below the mean. However, within those scores, there might be some that are a bit higher or significantly higher than others. And those represent relative strengths within the individual that we need to tap into when we're providing instructions. We want that information. Okay. This is a biggie. We don't want to let our evaluators off the hook. We just don't want numbers from these folks. We want information. What does Elwood's cognitive profile tell us about potential instructional approaches or strategies? We want recommendations from the persons who are working with us during these comprehensive evaluations to tell us, where do we go from here? What's next after your examination of the data? Okay. The next piece that we're going to look at is assess adaptive behavior. Basically, is the individual be able to respond to the day-to-day demands that we would expect of someone this person's age? When we have to do this and it's probably a good idea for many, but when we have to do it is if we suspect the youngster might be affected by an intellectual disability. Our regulation says that a student's performance must fall 1.5 standard deviation below the mean of intellectuality and exists concurrently with deficits in adaptive behavior. Okay. The domains a good adaptive behavior scale is going to address all of these domains. I'm not going to go through them. I think you pretty much know what each one of those are, but you'll end up with some scores. We don't want developmental scores for these, even though even though standard scores you get here are going to be fairly low. You're still going to be able to identify potential strengths and challenges. Developmental scores are going to be useless. We also want to know from the person who is interpreting the data and reporting it out. Well, we'll get there in a second. So here are some measures of adaptive behavior. The scale. So the scales of independent behavior is outdated now. It's an excellent tool, but it needs to be revised. We need the 3rd edition, so we can't use it anymore. I don't know if I mentioned it last time, but when a test is 10 years old or more, we cannot use it any longer because of the Flynn effect and just the norms have changed and grades scores just artificially become inflated. Violent adaptive behavior scales is a strong candidate. This one at school functioning assessment, I recommend highly because we're not just it's detailed. It lets us know, can this youngster, the youngster in question, navigate the school environment? Are there certain things we need to do at school in order to enhance the youngster's independence? When we look at the Vineland piece, there are some items on that, but it's not as detailed. So this is school functioning assessment. It's not that long. It's not that tough to complete. And that would be completed by someone who knows. So that's some of the issues to think about with these adaptive behavior measures. The ones that I just mentioned are well normed, but some of them are not as well normed, which means that there aren't enough people in the norm sample and they don't represent a large enough group. This is a big one. I would never suggest sending the Vineland adaptive behavior protocol home in an envelope for the parents to complete and then send back. It's very long. There are lots of questions on it, and I would say 1 out of 5 questions. When I've administered this orally to parents, 1 out of 5 questions, they have a question, or they don't understand the question, or they want clarification, or they want to discuss it with you to come up with a more accurate response to it. So it's really something that you have to do as in an interview format, or the reliability of it, I think, just plummets. Okay. Some of the issues around it is sometimes there's poor inter-rater agreement. I've been in situations where it's a mom and a dad, and they don't live together, and the youngster spends weekends with one parent and then the week the other, and you get these really just disparate ratings on these scales, and somehow you have to balance that. And frequently what happens is if you have other data like the school functioning assessment that kind of supports one or the other piece. Okay. The ratings are fairly subjective, and so that's why doing it in an interview format is so important, because you can help answer questions, and the parent will describe the situation, and that the Vineland manual actually gives you some guidance on how to respond to some of these questions and items that come up. Okay, and lastly, yep.
You have there's a comment. Tony said that one of the tests, that the adaptive behavior tests that you had in list, was something she's got on an evaluation right now. And you also had a question: what is the maladaptive domain?
Oh, okay.
I'm familiar with this.
Yep. So the maladaptive domain is thank goodness it's one of the shortest domains, and it has questions about behavior. Does the youngster things like, does the youngster have temper tantrums? The youth have temper tantrums? It's more behavioral stuff. To be perfectly honest, I often don't report it. If you have a youngster who does really child that's really poor on the maladaptive scale on this scale, you're going to have data from other places that is well known to folks that you can work with and identify, okay, what are we going to work on first, in terms of self-regulation and things like that. Yeah, so the maladaptive scale it only has a few items, which is good, and typically it's the smallest scale, and it just gets at negative behaviors that can get in the way of learning. It's basically what it is. Okay, and did you have a second question, Mary Ellen?
Well, just that Tony also put in that it's asocial behaviors.
Yeah. Yep. So they're get in the way of learning, get in the way with developing peer relationships, things like that. So there you may be able to draw. So part of this is when we get to the questions is an item analysis. What did we learn from this? What are some things that we need to work on? And so you from that maladaptive scale, you might have learned that we've got to work on some social skills here. We've got to work on initiating contact with peers in a positive way, whatever might have come up in that scale. Okay. Right. Finally, you want to make sure that typically you have more than one informant, but you want to make sure that they really know the student well. Here's where I'm going to put a pitch in for our paraprofessionals. It's whenever I do an evaluation, I always, and the youngster has a paraprofessional that supports them, I always make sure that I meet with that person, get their insights, and sometimes I've sat with the paraprofessional and the special educator, or the paraprofessional and the classroom teacher, and we completed, let's say, for example, the teacher part of the Vineland, and with both of them providing input, because the paraprofessional has eyes on all the time and sees the subtleties that sometimes when you're the teacher and you've got 20 little squirrels in your classroom and you're trying to herd all of them, and you don't see it, the whole thing relative to one particular student. Okay. All right. Some questions might we ask: what is Elwood's overall level of adaptive behavior? We need to know that and we can get that score from this because that's part of the eligibility piece if we're looking at an intellectual disability. Does Elwood demonstrate any significant or relative strengths within his adaptive profile? I've seen kids who have one of their biggest strengths is that social piece, that they've got these their social domain is through the roof. Okay, how do we tap into that? Okay, and then lastly, very important, what skills need to be developed in order for Elwood to progress within the adaptive behavior continuum? And so whoever is reviewing this data and looking at it needs to give us some guidance on where we need to go next in order to move on, because these adaptive behavior skills they're criterion referenced, and that means that someone, we'll call that person an expert, someone has determined that these are the skills you need at this certain age, and they tend to be on target, which means that and they build on each other. So if you're missing a particular skill, it might interfere, not always, but sometimes it interferes with your acquisition of a more complex or sophisticated skill that grows out of that initial skill. And so we need to address that, and we need we need that information from whoever reviewing the data and give that recommendation in our report. Okay. Some considerations for the adaptive is reliabilities. We want to make sure that we can hang our hat on the scores. The scores provided, we want standard scores so that we can, and not just developmental scores. Remember, we talked about percentile ranks as not being good scores to measure progress, but they're good scores to measure your current performance. So it's a percentile rank score is an okay score at this point, as long as we're not comparing it to 3 years ago when we had a adaptive behavior measure, because you can't compare scores to document growth. You can't use percentile ranks to document growth. And lastly, the breadth of coverage. I listed a number of adaptive behavior measures. Some of them are much longer than others. The longer it is, the greater the breadth of coverage. And And so we need to consider that. Do we really want to use this? Which test do we want to use, even though the violence stage, for example, might be more onerous and it take longer to do versus one of the other tests that's it's a little quicker and has fewer items, and you might yield similar domain scores. Okay, so this is the perfect timing. We promised we wouldn't make you sit forever. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about tests of academic achievement.
Rich,
Yes.
how come the Kaufman's not on there?
Because there are too many, but you're right. It could be there. I
Okay.
just had to pick, kind of limit them, but yep. So I'll mention that. It's a good point, Tony, that this is just a sampling. Well, if you think about ProEd, there are hundreds of tests. So
Right. I was wondering, I had a question back to, if I can ask it.
Yep.
When you were talking about using standardized scores or standard scores. So if in the adaptive scale, I mean, I have some scores that are like 13, 17, 19, and 57. So 57, it automatically makes me go, oh, here's a strength.
right. So depending on so if I recall, some of the scales are on a scale of 0 to 20, and some of them are on a scale of 40 to say 140. So be careful which one it's coming from, if you know what I mean.
This one is the standard score of 100 and the deviation 15.
Okay, then right. So is that the 53 one or the?
Well, that's all of those are from that test.
Okay.
So there's
Yeah. So you got that would qualify as a relative strength for sure.
right, which is personal living skills.
Yes. So yeah. So that area is taken care of, so they can blow their nose, they can toilet
Yeah.
themselves, and all those things. Yeah. And okay. Now the team needs to figure out where do we want to focus our energy now in terms
Right.
of independence. So with the adaptive behavior, the goal was always the highest level of independent functioning without anyone else's support. Well, that's what independent functioning means. So.
Right.
Tony just during the break raised an important point. And so I've just listed some of the most common assessments that I come across, but she raised a good point. So depending on what part of your state you live in, you might have some professionals or clinicians who have kind of adopted another set of tests. And so there are thousands of tests, and I couldn't list them all. So what I've done is listed the ones that I see most commonly being used, and also on subsequent time together, if people have certain tests that they want to talk about or want to kind of review or put that in the chat, and then we'll make that happen. So again, this test of academic is no way exhaustive. It's what I've done is put in the ones that I see the most used frequently. And I just want to point out that on the last one I put in is the ProEd family and narrows focus test. They publish a ton of stuff. You just need to be careful that if you're using them for eligibility, that they rise to the level of reliability that we've talked about at 0.9 or above. But if you're using some of these narrow focus tests to find personal strengths and weaknesses and inform instruction, then it's a little less rigorous in terms of statistical requirements for them. They tend not to have the highest reliability as in psychometric properties as other test developers. The thing if you've noticed in the slide, I put the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test 5 in red. You got to have this in your trunk of your car if you're working with this population. So many youngsters have fairly accurate pointing responses, and so if you're not familiar with the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, what it is, it's an array of 4 pictures, and you say point to and you say whatever it is, and then they have to have to point. And they're not just, so it starts off point to the truck, but they get, as a progressive, it gets into to slides that point to thing more abstract. So it'll have a picture and they have more abstract terms, and that they have to point to the correct one that represents enjoyment, for example. And so that's a biggie. It's most of the time when I'm evaluating a youngster who has communication challenges, this is one of the first things that I do. Just a quick story about this, and this was years ago, but just the power of this test. So I was asked to do an evaluation. It was a young gal in middle school who had cerebral palsy, and it affected most of her core, and she had a great deal of difficulty generating air to communicate with speech, and so exhausting. And so we started. So when I first met her, she was she had a little office space set up in the office of where the special educators were housed, and she had a paraprofessional working with her, and the special educator, and that's where she was all day. Now, this was a long time ago, and so I administered one of the first things I did was administer the puberty picture vocabulary test, and then I did whatever other things I could. And when I wrote out the report, I shared that this is a measure of receptive vocabulary, and that receptive vocabulary has the highest correlation with overall cognitive abilities. So anytime you measure vocabulary, if you get a high score there, it suggests overall your cognitive skills are pretty good. Well, she got a 115 on the puberty picture vocabulary test, which means she was this is by pointing, a standard deviation above the mean, which means that this gal who was in a mobility device was taking in everything around her. So the point of it, the next time I went back there, they had shut down that little office that they had, and she was now in the regular ed setting. And so this is one of my famous puberty picture vocabulary test story, that it just got people thinking about this little person in a whole different way. The fact that she bing did so well on this test. So anyway, a shout out. That's the only test I'm going to endorse. Obviously, people who know me know I'm a big Woodcock-Johnson guy, but I'm going to try to be neutral here throughout this. But except this puberty picture vocabulary, there's such a wide range of folks who can participate in this test, and it provides valuable information that is related to overall cognitive functioning. All right, so let's go to the next one. So just mention the notion between the difference between an achievement battery and a narrow focus test. So achievement batteries are things like the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement and the Wechsler individual achievement scales and Kaufman. And so what they do is they measure all of the basic skills. So that's convenient. And depending on the test, it means that you can be fairly confident that all those tests that you're looking at within that battery have high reliability and validity. So it makes your job a little easier. The drawback is that there tend to be fewer items. So the scope, depending on the test, the scope can be somewhat narrow, or it can be okay. But anyway, then a narrow focus test. So for example, the key math, for example, all it does is measure math, and you're going to have a lot more items and a lot more. So sometimes what we'll do is, if we have a significant challenge in one of the basic skill areas on one of these achievement batteries, we may decide to administer another test that has more items so that we can kind of pinpoint where the issues lie. Just want to mention, these are the basic skill areas that we got to be looking at, and to be sure that kids are making growth. There are some considerations with these bad test batteries and the achievement tests. Reliability, really important. Again, 0.9 or above if we're making decisions. Say, okay, we think the youngster might be affected by a learning disability. 0.8 or above if we're going to make decisions about programmatic work in conjunction with other data we have. We want to make sure they have the scores that we need for the work we're doing. What's the breadth of coverage? So even though it's a test battery, you might take a look at, say, the math calculation test. So we'll say, for example, on the Woodcock-Johnson, and say, yeah, that seems to cover everything that we're interested in. It sounds good. Okay. The whole notion of item selection, are there parts of it that you might want to use and parts that you don't want to use? This is really important. It is sometimes overlooked. Cluster index composite composites. So those are names that, so when you combine two tests together, it either will be called a cluster score, an index score, or a composite score. And so, for example, on the Woodcock-Johnson, if you give the letter word ID test, which is you have to look at words that are phonetically irregular, and you have to be familiar. You have to know them. We call them sight words, but they're phonetically irregular words. So you have one of those tests, and then you have the word attack test, which is these are made up words, but they follow the rules of phonics, and so you have to read those, and that gives us so we're having two tests. One gives us an idea of how are you with decoding phonetically regular words, and how are you with your sight vocabulary, words that you have to have been exposed to and have memorized. And those combine to give you the basic reading cluster score, which is a good score because you have two measures of basic reading. However, on the Wechsler individual achievement test, when you look at the basic reading score, it includes a reading comprehension test and a basic skills test. And that's a problem because suppose you have strong word identification skills. So you do really well on the reading, the basic reading test. But your knowledge of vocabulary stinks and your reading comprehension stinks. So now you've given that second test and you do poorly. So let's make believe one was a 115, and that's the basic reading test. And your reading comprehension test was, we'll say just for the heck of it, was 85, which is a standard deviation below the mean, which means it's a significant challenge. Well, you might get a cluster score, basic reading cluster score there of 100, which suggests that you don't have any challenges with reading comprehension, okay? I mean, with basic reading. So here's the message. You have to be careful to whatever test that you're using. If you're using these cluster scores where they're combining other tests, you got to make sure that the two tests that comprise the cluster are actually measuring the same thing. You see the same problem on the Wechsler individual achievement test when you look at math calculation. It has a calculation score, but it also has a math reasoning score. Well, those are two different basic skills that you can't combine in one score. Hopefully that's clear to folks. And so this is part of your psychologist or your assessment person knowing these tests and guiding and directing you, or you in turn, you knowing it and guiding and directing them. Okay. And then lastly, considerations, achievement battery versus narrow focused. If you look at the achievement battery and you believe it's met the needs for this youngster, you're good to go. If you think that we need a little more information regarding this basic skill, you may want to pick one of the narrow focus skills that has more tests, that has more items for that basic skill area. Okay. All right. What are the questions going to ask? Does Elwood demonstrate any relative strengths within the basic skill areas? You may even want to go as far as listing them out. Or in this case, just you're asking to look at all the basic skills. What specific skills related to each basic skill area does Elwood possess? So in order to be a good reader, there are certain underlying skills that you need. What does Elwood have? And then what specific skills need to be developed in order for Elwood to progress within each basic skill area? So your as I said earlier, your eval reports and the data you get back are only as good as the questions asked. So in this one here, we want them to know, we want them to tell us, what can this kid do in reading and writing and math? That's what we're interested in. And then what do we need to work on in order to get back on a positive trajectory or what comes next in line in terms of what we want to do in this, whatever the basic skill area is. And by asking them specifically, they've got to respond. If they send you a report and it's not there, send it back. All right. So we're going to move into some other different kinds of tests. So any thoughts or questions or anything before we move on? All righty. Okay. Curriculum-based assessment. And I just want to mention, we're also going to talk about curriculum-based measurement, which is different. So that's why I highlighted the A. So curriculum-based assessment tends to occur within a general ed setting, and it can be important for us to look at this so that we can figure out what is it we need to do so that the youngsters we're working with can access the general ed curriculum. So basically what it is it's a test that the teachers developed that samples the skills they've been taught to a specific point in time. So maybe it's the first 5 weeks of school, and then I'm going to administer this test to see, well, if we think about math, have they mastered the math concepts that I've been trying to inculcate over the past 5 weeks. After you administer the test and you score it, you might determine that somehow this whole long division, just as an aside, I haven't met a middle school student who can remember how to do long division in years. So it needs to be recursive in nature. So suppose we were working on long division and now it didn't catch when I did this first sample 5 weeks into the year. Now I know it informs instruction. I need to go back and review that. And then finally, what I do is I start to set up a schedule of assessment. So this data will be available to you and you can use it to relate to what we need to do with our students. So if you look at this, is kind of complicated, but try to make it a simple. So we had time 1, and this is what we're looking at. Does he understand the commutative property of multiplication? Does he demonstrate how to multiply 3-digit numbers? I put a minus there because it didn't happen. So after 5 weeks, they didn't have this multiplying 3-digit numbers. So I provide instruction and I go back and I redo this. Now, 4 weeks later, I do my next curriculum-based assessment and I include, it's recursive. So I put back in, demonstrate how to multiply 3-digit numbers. There's a plus sign that means, yes, they got it. But also along the way, the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks, I've also been helping them to understand that division and multiplication are inverse operations. Do they get that? Okay, and then again, and then it goes on and on. I understand the demonstration of their opposite, so checking that. Demonstrate understanding of decimal notation and money. Add, subtract value, and then what do I sneak in here? Demonstrate how to multiply 3-digit numbers. I'm going back again because that's been a problem. So that's the nature of curriculum-based assessment. It's a general ed process that we can use as part of our comprehensive evaluation work. The way we slide our youngster in. Okay. Some aspects we might ask here are what aspects of the general education curriculum can Elwood currently access? This is for, and again, a lot of people are going to be weighing in on this answer. The classroom teacher, the paraprofessional, the special educator, parents perhaps. What specific accommodations or adaptations might increase Elwood's participation within the general ed setting? And then what specific skills, if developed, would enhance Elwood's participation within the general ed curriculum? Now, this is an interesting one. This doesn't necessarily have to be an academic skill. What if Elwood is someone who screams every time something happens that he's not happy with, and he tends to scream at a high rate? Somehow we have to work on a different way for Elwood to communicate his dissatisfaction with us, because there's going to come a time when perhaps people are going to say, hey, this high rate of screaming in the classroom is getting in the way of this participation within the general ed curriculum. So I have a story later about a young gal with this incredible mobility device that was having some challenges in a high school classroom, but relative to this whole noise type thing. So, all right. Now, curriculum-based measurement. If you're going down an RTI model or a patterns of strength and weakness model, or anytime we're putting programs in place for youngsters, we need to be doing curriculum-based measurements. And that is that what it does is they help us monitor the progress. And so they're fairly quick. They're just signs of general ed achievement. So for example, in order to be a good reader, we need to know our letter names. So with our youngest kids or students, we're going to have these measures where they just have to quickly read, 1 minute worth. And can you name the letters as quickly as other folks? Then we move on. Say, okay, what are the letter sounds? Okay. And then we move on. Now okay, what are the letter CVC words? They might be nonsense words. They might be real words. Can you read those? All the time, checking to see how quickly they can do this, because the notion of fluency suggests that we've mastered the skill. Want to mention that they're standardized. There are certain ways you have to administer them and score them. So we need to do that. So we're all on the same page. If more than one person are administering and scoring these, we're all going to get the same results. They're really short. Most of them are 1 minute. Some of the writing ones are come up to 3 minutes, but typically they're 1 minute. And the reason is if I'm asking you to read CVC words and you can read 20 of them in 1 minute, how many do you think you can read in 2 minutes? You got it. Around 40. 3 minutes, around 60. So the research has indicated a 1 minute sample is adequate. And it lets us know how things are going. These are very sensitive to improvement in growth. So one of the ways to turbocharge any work we're doing with youngsters and we're measuring their progress is to have the youngster be involved in the graphing of their own progress. So for example, if you have a youngster and you're learning the letter sounds, and the first time they do it, they can say, we'll say 15 in 1 minute. We would graph that, and then we practice that. We measure it a week later, we'll say, or now you can do 20. We put that on the graph. And we actually, when I've done this with kids, when I had contracts with school that I could visit once a week, I would meet with them, and then they put my laptop up. They put the data in. We click it, and they could see their graph. There's research that shows that when students are involved with graphically monitoring their own behavior, their own growth through these visual graphs, that's what a graph is. It's a visual representation. They make more growth than youngsters who are not participating in that. So that's why I call it a turbocharge. Anytime you're graphing the results and the youngsters doing with the assessment results and the youngsters watching that with you and setting goals, perhaps, okay, let's set a goal for 24 next time we do this, and working towards that goal, you're going to get better. You're going to get more growth. Okay. Some important things to remember about these is they're equivalent in difficulty. So if you change how difficult each measure is, well, you're measuring the difficulty of the item and not the youngster. And so they tend out. So if they tend to start maybe a little challenging. And then as the youngster improves, the score goes up. You do it as frequent as possible. The big part about representing the data graphically is a huge part of this. And then we can use it to make the instructional decisions. I just want to I just want to show you this graph. So this is we're teaching a particular skill, and these ones on the bottom represent the weeks that we're providing instruction in this, and the column on the left is the score. And that aim line is the goal that we set in the beginning of the program on week 1. And usually that aim line is set as an ambitious goal that gets us towards what a typical student might be doing at that time. So that blue line is where we want to be. So if you notice that the dots, the black dots on the left side of that dotted line, vertical dotted line, those are the scores that the youngster got. And that's typically how they go. It's rare that you get one that just goes consistently up. They tend to be erratic. And that's why putting that trend line in place. So the computer put in that trend line, the red trend line. And the team looked at this and said, you know something? They're making growth here, but it's not really closing the gap. So if you were to extend out that red trend line out to week 15 at the same level of the same incline, you're not really getting as close to that aim line, that goal that you set. And so what they did is they made an instructional change at this point, and they start collecting data. And now you see that the trend line has changed. It's growing more steep. We still are going. So this is an interesting thing, and this is something important to point out. We're still parallel with this line, and this aim line represents the growth of a typical student. So this is fairly common what we see with youngsters who are receiving special ed services. Is that they tend to they're making the growth at the same rate as their peers, but guess what? They're behind. And see how it's consistent? That's never going to match. So at some point we have to say, how do we get more growth? How do we set more ambitious goals? Because our goal is to close that gap. And this graph is telling us, even though we're making growth, when the school year ends, this youngster is still going to be behind. So what do we need to do to increase that graph? Okay. All right. So that's just something, if next year and the years to come, you're going to see more of these graphs, because this is going to be part of what's required through our regulations. All right.
Rich,
Yes.
there's a question. Is there a list of standardized curriculum-based measures?
Yes, what I can do is one of the big ones is one called Ames Web. There's Progress Pro. There's a number of commercially available, and typically what will happen is a district will subscribe, and more of these. So just to kind of give a little historical perspective, probably 10 years ago, the Agency of Education of Vermont saw what was coming down the road, and we had a number of pilot programs implementing RTI, and part of it was responsive to intervention. Part of it was all these schools got subscriptions to Ames Web, and they create these graphs for you and all that. And it was a huge resource to these districts. You don't have to create the assessments; they're there. You plug it in, it's the scores, and it makes the graphs for you. But Ames Web is just one of them. That's the one that the state of Vermont. One of the things I did for the state was reviewed all the different commercially available curriculum-based assessments, measurements, and that was the one that was the most, I think, at the time, the most user-friendly and provided the best results, and blah, blah, blah. So they went with that. But something else shiny came by, and now we're talking about MTSS, and the focus tends now to be on tiered instruction versus progress monitoring and early intervention and things like that, which is why I still use the term RTI, because we can't lose all those other pieces. We have to progress monitor. So I can, for part of the resource services, I can make a list of some of the commercially available places where you can get these things.
So Rich,
Yeah.
Tony just shared that they're using Track My Progress.
Yeah. So there are quite a few that have popped up over the past couple of years, because there's these test publishers are seeing the trend. This is where it's going. When more and more the discrepancy model is going away, and we have to have ways to track whether or not the interventions that we're providing are effective. Also, they're good screening tools as well. So typically, a lot of what districts do is they only take a minute. They'll administer. So, for example, with their kindergarten students, they'll administer all kids will get the letter name curriculum-based measurement, and those that pass, off you go, no problem. Those that don't, they get some supplemental services, and okay, we got to get these letter names down. Then they graduate to the letter sounds, et cetera, et cetera. The same is for reading fluency and things as you progress through the grades. They have different grade levels, and you can use them to identify those at risk, get those services early, and then avoid more intensive specialized instruction or special education services because you've picked it up early. Just as a note, if there's a bunch of research that came out of the Midwest that if only 1 in 17 kids if you're not reading at grade level by the third grade, only 1 in 17 kids will actually graduate being reading on grade level. So as a third grader, those kids who are not reading on grade level at the end of the year, only 1 in 17 of them will be grade level readers when they graduate, because we haven't picked them up soon enough. So this is why I'm a big proponent of the early intervention and the screening that we can use with these tests, these curriculum-based measurements, rather than focusing just on the tiered approach, which is important, but you got to pick these folks up early so that they can get supplemental services in tier 2, if that's how it's defined in your district. All righty. Any other
So
thoughts?
Rich,
Yeah.
Krista shared that many schools have universal screeners that also have curriculum-based measures,
Yes.
and suggested asking your district what they're using.
Yep.
And Leah,
That's exactly what I just wanted. That's exactly what they called universal screeners. Yep.
yeah, and Leah shared we use STAR, and Leah, I also see you have your hand up. So, and just before we go to Leah, Krista also added, but to note, some of these assessments or curriculum-based measurements are not always used with kids who have complex learning profiles.
Yeah.
Can we go to you, Leah?
Sure. I apologize if we talked about this briefly. I was with a student for a little bit, but I was wondering if we had discussed multilingual learners. I have a new multilingual learner that was also diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So I was just wondering your thoughts on that, Rich, and
Yes.
because
That's
many
a whole can of worms. So
I know.
so we got two problems with that, with multilingual learners. One is that they and oftentimes will not understand the questions or the items and all that. The second problem is, even if we do a translation, there are so many cultural linked items that they don't, depending on where they're from, they don't understand what we're talking about with those items. Now, having said that, again, I just the Woodcock-Johnson has a test, an oral language test. What language is your? What language is your person's primary language?
Nepali
Okay.
or Nepalese, I guess.
This won't help, so I'm not even going to talk about it. Had it been Spanish, I had a suggestion for you, but and again, it's a low incidence population, so there's no money in it, and so that's why we don't have these tests. But we have to be really careful, even when they're translated, and that's for us and interpreted. That's the third problem. Many interpreters will tell you that there isn't a one-to-one correspondence. So frequently when they're interpreting, they're providing the response. So if it's a test item, their interpretation actually provides the response to the item that is being asked. And so it's a tough one. I don't have the answer to that. We don't have a lot of tests out there for them. And now you've got the dual thing with a youngster who was affected by an autism spectrum disorder. So you got those communication issues there as well. So sorry, Leah, I couldn't. I wish
That's okay.
I had the. If
No
I had this, I'd
worries.
write the book, and I'd be great. I could retire. You really
I know.
would.
You can retire now.
Well, good
So-
luck.
Rich, you have another question from
Yep.
Molly. Is there a curriculum-based measure like AIMSweb that is aligned with the alternate standards rather than the Common Core?
So it's hard to say. So they curriculum-based measurements tend to look at underlying skills, not terminal skills. So for example, when we're looking at a curriculum-based measurement for reading, it starts off with, can you say the letter names? You have to know the letter names. Then it progresses to, do you know the letter sounds? And then it progresses to, can you combine the sounds to make words? And then it progresses to reading whole sentences correctly. And so it looks at a terminal skill of reading fluency, which is your ability, the way they define it on curriculum-based measurements, your ability to read the words correctly at the same rate as a peer. And so these are just kind of the basic underlying skills and they don't tend to reference any of the any specific curriculum, if you know what I mean. It's just, these are the skills that you need to build on in order to become a proficient reader.
So thank you. That was really helpful.
Okay.
I maybe later or at the end of the training, I would love to ask a few more clarifying questions about that. I just don't want to take up the time now.
Yeah, if you post them, we'll deal with them. All righty. So now we're going to get into, I think the timing's good. The whole notion of cross-battery assessment. And so what I did, I just put up 3 of the most common. There are other ones, but these are the ones I sent to see people using. And well, the 2 I see that people using is the Wechsler scales, which is in the right-hand corner, and then the Woodcock-Johnson, the lower. And in the upper left-hand corner, I put in the Binet scales. And the reason I include them is, number one, it's psychometrically, it's an excellent test. It's got good reliabilities and validities. But the nice part about it, it measures 5 of the cognitive skills that I mentioned from that first chart when you looked at those skills that are necessary for improvement. And it has 2 tests for each one of those skills. One of them does not require verbal responding. So if you have a youngster who has communication issues, this is the test that there's a possibility they could complete half of this test and actually get a score. And it's called the low verbal score. It's not called the nonverbal score because there's really no such thing as a nonverbal test. You don't have to respond verbally. So some of these nonverbal tests, it's a misnomer. Just because you don't have to respond verbally does not mean it doesn't mean it doesn't have language demands. They do. Most of these tests that have nonverbal in their names require you to have language skills like categorization and concept formation and things like that. But they do not require you to speak in the responding. So I include the Stanford Binet, even though it's outdated and it's in the process of being renormed. It's still something that we can use, and it's a potential for a lot of tests in there. That's someone that is on our caseload who has difficulty with verbal communication might be able to respond to. Okay, all right. So why this cross-battery thing? It allows us to use a whole bunch of different assessment tools. As we said, there aren't a lot of tools out there developed for our population of kids with really unique learning challenges. So and styles. So that we can pull from all these different pieces. We're able to focus on an individual's response style and response mode and what they can do while we're pulling, rather than I've seen reports where psychologists have administered tests to kids who did not have the physical capacity to respond to the test. A thing like block design is a thing where you have to move these blocks and copy certain shapes. But it was administered to a youngster with cerebral palsy who had difficulty with fine motor movements, and then it's reported as being a challenge. It's a measure of visual processing, and it's reported as being a challenge when in fact what it's really measuring in that case is her fine motor coordination. So we're able to kick out all those things that are just going to measure the disability or the challenge rather than the skill. We're able to utilize reliable and valid measures. We try to. We can get information about specific skills and allows us to get multiple measures in certain areas, depending, coming from different tests. And it allows us to respond more adequately to evaluation questions. Here's the thing that we always mention: if we're going to use this approach during a comprehensive evaluation, you typically will not get a composite or an overall score, something like a GIA or an IQ. The exception being, if for some reason you had a youngster who was able to respond to all of the 5 tests on the low verbal portion of the Stanford Binet, you would be able to get what's called a low verbal IQ score. Okay. How do we do it? The evaluator has to become familiar with the student's response capabilities. And I already said one of the people that I'm going to be chatting with is the paraprofessional. I'm also going to talk with mom and dad. I'm going to talk with the classroom teacher. I'm going to talk with the special educator. If there's another consultant, it's not unusual for me to talk with a representative consultant from Vermont Association of Visual Impairment Blind, or VABI, or any other folks who are working with the youngster to find out what are they able to do? What are their motor skills like? What are their verbal skills like? I'll observe the student and I'll get this information, and then we'll start to work as a team figuring out, okay, what are some of the things we might want to try? What might be some appropriate tools or instruments to try to answer the evaluation question? We give it the tryout, doesn't always work. So we come up with some, let's try this, and it doesn't always work. We go back to the, one of the things about this approach is patience and creativity. So we came up with an idea about a test that we're going to administer, and then it gets blown out of the water. Okay, let's go back now. What's the next step? What are we going to do? And then lastly, when we're all said and done, we're going to be reporting out strengths and challenges and making recommendations. It may not necessarily be numbers. It might, in some cases, it might. If I get a good number, I always report that. But if it's a yucky number, it doesn't really help us much. Then we focus on what are the strengths and what are the challenges, and what are we going to do to make things go. Okay. All right. So we're gonna have an activity going in a bit. So I just want to talk about something. So accommodations. So when we look at these tests, I'm going to provide you with some resources as we go into our little activity group in about five minutes. I'm going to provide you with some resources that tell you about the tests, and then you're going to have an activity whereby, and I'll explain it when we get to it. But and so just a notion about an accommodation is that the purpose is to remove any obstacles that might be in the way of the individual we're concerned about participating in the test without changing what the test is testing. Okay. So this is going to allow us to get as much information as possible. So let's talk about some of these accommodations that we might see. Visual magnifying equipment. I had a young gal with a visual impairment who was quite mobile around the school with, she had a cane that she made herself around the school, but she also had this piece of equipment that you would place any written materials on a tray, and then it magnified it. So what I did with her was we brought that equipment to the space we were working. I took the materials apart. I would hand her each, if it was a visual thing, visual task, I would hand it to her. She would put it in the little machine. This is an elementary school student. Probably, I think she was around the 3rd grade. Put it in the machine, adjust it, and then I would pose the question and she would respond, and we do it. Now, did that take a long time? It did, but we got great results. It was print enlargement. Sometimes we just kind of enlarge whatever it is that we're working with through the Xerox machines, whatever. Audio amplification. It's not unusual for me to borrow the teachers. This is an FM system. While I'm working with the youngster, I have the FM unit around my neck, and we're using that. I've had high school students who were aided, who were hearing aids, and when I shared with them that I had some auditory processing assessments that I probably was not going to administer because it would put them at a disadvantage. They said, no, I want to do it. I want to see how it works out with my hearing aids. And so we've done that. We can use markers to help them keep place. We can read directions aloud. We can paraphrase the instructions if we want. Keep in mind, every time we make an accommodation, we will report that in our report. We can record the directions if necessary to play them back. We can provide multiple choice options if that's an example, a possibility depending on the item. We can give additional items. Sometimes youngsters don't quite get what it is that we're looking for, and so we can provide additional items. Materials secured to the desk with tape or other stuff. So for example, I had a youngster who, I don't recall the name of it, but her vision straight on was almost nil, but her peripheral vision was good. So when I met with the paraprofessional who supported this youngster, she showed me where I needed to orient materials. And I would orient the material there and just stick a little piece of tape on it so we can go anywhere, and then check with the student, and off we went. So the materials had to be either to the far right or to the far left. Directions presented through perhaps an interpreter sign. Okay to present the directions, and not okay to get the results signed to the interpreter and then the interpreter providing it to us. That doesn't really work out. Highlighting test materials so it draws your attention to them, orienting the materials special way, increasing spacing between items, anything that can make the visual representation of the materials better. The second way is response accommodations. One of the most unusual response was a youngster who was in high school, who was affected by cerebral palsy, and her core was affected, and she had a great difficulty creating speech. But she was a really ambitious and hardworking little gal, and she would work to provide responses, and after 2 or 3 responses, I still couldn't understand what she was saying, and it was exhausting. So we stopped, and we decided to do it at the youngster's house. So here's what we did. We started doing the administration at the youngster's house in the living room, and the mom was in the kitchen away from everything, and so couldn't hear anything. And so we had a thing whereby more often than not, I could understand the youngster's response. It's a verbal response. But we came up with an agreement after 2 times that the youngster provided the response and I didn't get it. We had a bell, and I would ring the bell, and mom would come in, not having heard the item, and the young gal would give her response to mom, and mom would give it to me. And more often than not, it was on target, because mom, not like me, was accustomed to her speech style. And so obviously I included that in the report, but that's an allowable accommodation because mom wasn't there to hear it. Okay. We can have scribes if it allows. So you just always have to remember, is this accommodation changing the task? We can record responses. So youngsters who we suspect of being affected by an autism spectrum disorder, the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation System, is a really helpful and important tool. But there's so much stuff with that it's really hard to, I believe, score accurately in the moment. So when I administer that, I will try to score it accurately in the moment, but I also set up my Smarter Than Me phone, and I videotape all the sessions that I'm administering the ADOS. And then I go back to my office and I plug my Smarter Than Me phone into my big TV, and I watch it there and I score. And that increases the reliability dramatically. So if we can change the format somehow, communication devices, using those, allowing pointing. So just kind of any kind of response accommodations. Settings, where does it, as I mentioned, I figured out this is going to be easier to do at home. So we went home. The other part about it was that the whole comfortable setting, this young person had this incredible mobility device that had like a zillion buttons on the controls, and she could work this thing independently. So that was my first sign that there's a lot going on with this kid. If she can work this darn thing. And what it did was, this machine, it was, I don't want to call it a wheelchair because it was more than that, but it was motorized and get around, but it was seated. It would stand her up. She could push buttons and it would stand her or would incline her. And anyway, while we were working, she would move that thing around and become comfortable as possible at her home while we were or doing the administration of the assessment. So that contributed to better outcomes because she was more comfortable. I need to share one of the issues for this youngster. They wanted this youngster to go to a school. This was not in Vermont, but they wanted the youngster to go to a school that was located in a hospital, if you can believe that, and not be in her local high school. And one of the reasons was of the noise that her mobility equipment made. So I observed in a classroom, and it's a high school classroom, and the teacher provided verbal instruction for 50 minutes, just talking at the kids. And so when you watch the rest of the kids, they're all shifting in their seats, they're all getting up, they're dropping pencils, all sorts of stuff going on. However, when our friend shifted herself, you would hear a click and a hum, because the machine that she was using was adjusting her. She was doing the same thing as all the other kids, except the teachers were annoyed that her unit would make these sounds whenever she was adjusting herself, which just blew me away. But again, not in Vermont. And just to let you know, she got to stay in her local school. She didn't go anywhere. Okay.
Reg,
Yes.
there's a question. Can you please share again the name of this assessment and what grade level is this appropriate for?
Which
Thank you.
assessment? Which?
Michelle? Was there a
Yeah,
particular
did you say the ADASI?
ADOS?
Oh,
ADAS.
oh yeah, it's called the Autism Diagnostic Observation Scale. It's huge. It comes in a tub that you could put a body in. It's enormous.
Okay.
And what it is, it's a great tool because it's activities, and you engage in the activities and you're watching to see, does this youngster respond in the same way we would expect, and I put in air quotes, typical youngsters to respond? Do they share interest? You know, there's a variety of things. Every activity, you're looking for certain behaviors that persons affected by autism typically do not demonstrate. You're also looking for activities or behaviors that persons with autism might frequently. So, for example, there are some interesting tools there, toys that you can spin them, and so when the youngster grabs it and starts spinning it, and you can't get them to stop, there's a data point, if you know what I mean. And so it's a big tool to call it. It's a big test, costs a lot of money, and you need pretty specific training on it. But it's a great tool. It's a great way to interact with kids and get to know them. I've used it mostly with school aid. It goes all the way up to adulthood, I believe.
Thank you. Would it be appropriate for like first, second grade?
Yes.
Or
Yep.
is it
Yep.
older? Okay.
I've tended to use it
Thank you.
with kindergarten and first, because that's when schools start to say, there's something a little different about Billy. We need to take a closer look at this.
So I'm sorry. I don't want to take that.
I just want to mention too, it's only one part of the assessment evaluation as well. It's just one part of it. There's a lot of other stuff too.
Right. So really this is just looking for autism diagnosis, but it's not aiding in assessment for what do we do for the child.
Right.
So,
right.
Okay, sorry. I needed to clarify. Thank you.
Okay.
Reg, I think we're past.
Part of this whole cross-battery assessment is that it's going to apply to our folks, but as I keep saying, it's going to apply to everybody in a year. It's going to require on people who are doing our evaluations knowing these tests and what they measure and how they measure. And I thought it would be helpful if you folks also knew that as well, so you can support and encourage your evaluators to take this kind of approach. So what I did was I took some of it's like couldn't do all the tests. This takes forever, but anyway, I took some of the most commonly occurring tests you're going to see, and I've broken out by the skills that they measure that influence. And I have some slides later, if we get to them, that I'll show you what cognitive skills influence what basic skill areas. So the way this works is it looks at fluid reasoning, quantitative reasoning. So fluid reasoning is your ability to problem solve in novel situations. So what I did was I list the name of the test battery, the Woodcock-Johnson, the 5th edition, what the test is, concept formation, the age that people can use it next to it, and then what they have to do. And so so I do that for all the fluid reasoning tests. Then I go down and I do it for the comprehension knowledge test. Comprehension knowledge is what you know as a result of being on the planet. It's typically stuff we don't teach in school, but what do you know about the world in general? And so these are measures of that and what's required. And then I go through the 7 areas that are measured by the Woodcock-Johnson, but I also include the other tests that like the Wechsler scales, the Stanford-Binet, their tests. So, and then on the right, I started to put in a couple of accommodations that I've used in the past, but this is the same thing, except it looks at achievement tests. What's the test? What's the name of what's the test battery? What's the name of the test? Letter word ID. What does the student have to do? Based on that student that you have, what accommodations might you make? So you might kind of scroll down through here, see what there are things that you can do to accommodate. And so the person can participate in this and we get some information about the basic skill area. So I want to mention when you get put into a group, you're going to have a scenario, but if someone in that group has an impending evaluation coming up and you want to describe that student to the group and you want to work on that and your group members agree, that's fine and come out with that. But otherwise, just you can do the practice on the scenario that you're provided. So any questions about the task at hand? What I'm asking you to do is to kind of review these different assessments and how might we include our person in the assessment without changing the accommodation, providing an accommodation that does not change the construct we're measuring. You really, unless you're intimately familiar with all these tests, you really won't know what the expectation is for the individual to participate, and so won't be able to make an accommodation. Okay, but there's a lot here. Okay, let's just do this. Let's just look at a few in chat, and then we can go back to the PowerPoint. So the first thing we're looking at, fluid reasoning, and as I said, that's reasoning in novel situations. And so here's what's on this concept formation, as the name suggests, how well is the youngster able to identify concepts and actually formulate them? So the student's required to identify the rules for concepts when shown illustrations and non-instances of the concept. So on this, so let me cut to the quick. So on this test, there are categories of concepts, and one of them is size, one of them is color, one of them is shape, and one of them is number. And so for someone who is not affected by any kind of communication or motor issues or anything, when you show them the items, they have to tell you, they have to identify what's the pattern here. How are things, does this pattern represent a difference in size, color, number? So what you can do if you have someone who is not able to respond verbally, you could make up, what I've done in the past is made up what I call concept cards. And so sometimes the color, the answer is either going to be red or yellow. So they would have a card and they could hand red or yellow, or they could point to red or yellow. Sometimes it's size. So you would have a card that has something big on it, something small. They can point to small, they could point to big. And so that's one of the ways that I've used that for folks who had difficulty with communicating after they presented the information. Okay. The other thing that we can do in this is that it's a controlled learning task. And this is one of the reasons I started talking about this. So in a controlled learning task, what you're doing is you're teaching this individual in front of you this new task. They've never done this concept formation task before, unless we were evaluated 3 years ago and they probably don't remember it. But anyway, and so we're teaching them this task. And then if they get it wrong, we provide corrective feedback. So in this task, if if the answer was color and it was supposed to be yellow when they handed me the red, I would give it back and I would point to the yellow one and say the answer is yellow. And so what's happening during here is I'm keeping track to see if the youngster benefits from this corrective feedback. And if they do, that's a huge part of the evaluation, because I'm teaching this youngster a new skill. And on a one-on-one situation with corrective feedback and practice, they're getting the skill. So we're kind of the same holds true for this analysis synthesis test. So what it's measuring, and again, it's a picture one. So this one here, I can give it a great example of what we did. It was a young man with on the autism spectrum, and this is what the team said. And I love it when the team says this. I hear it quite often. They said, "We think there's more going on in there than he can tell us." And I love when I hear that, because it demonstrates that, yeah, they got faith in this kid. They want to hold high expectations. They know there's something there, and they just want help getting it out. So this, I'll just kind of elaborate on this one, because it shows how the paraprofessionals are so important as well too. So I had met with everyone, and so for this test, I took index cards, and what happens is you answer by stating a color. So it shows these patterns, and you have to figure out what's happening. So the color is either going to be black, it's going to be red, it's going to be yellow, or blue. And so I created 4 index cards and met with the youngster. And on all these tests, the other thing about the Woodcock-Johnson is you always teach the test before you administer it. So you know that a person understands the test expectations before you administer it. Otherwise, you might be giving the test and they're getting it all wrong because they don't get it. I could tell when I was giving the instructions, this youngster was nonverbal. I could tell by his body language and facial expression, he was getting this and actually looked like this was going to be fun for him. And so anyway, I administered the practice once. We get into the test, and I'll cut to the quick. Every time I presented an item, he handed me the black card. And so what I did is I moved the order of the cards. I thought sometimes kids have preferences. They pull the thing from the far right or pull it from the, so I changed the order up. He still keeps giving me the black card. So I said, well, this isn't going to work. We stopped. So later on, I processed with the paraprofessional, and I showed her everything. I said, well, he keeps giving me the black card. And so she said, what were the instructions? I said, well, give me the card, the color that matches. And she said, well, the black one's the only one that matches. So I said, no, wait a minute, this is red. And she said, it's not the same red as on your easel. He's very particular. He's not going to pick that. So the black one was the only. So anyway, I'd go to the quick. So this is a good example of how you have to be patient and quick. So I go to the Xerox. So next time I'm there, I'd gone to a Xerox machine, Xerox the page, and I put it on glossy photo paper so that the color would match perfectly. And then I cut them out. I put them down, and we start. I administered the practice items began. We start the thing. He picks up the first one and then throws it on the floor and sweeps the rest of the cards onto the floor. So I pick them all up, I put them back, I do the next one, he sweeps them all onto the floor. So being a highly trained psychologist, I inferred he didn't want to do this right now. So we stop. So I meet again with the paraprofessional and show her the stuff. And she said, he's not going to touch those. They feel creepy. He has sensitivity issues. So I said, okay. So now I go back. This time I make it on the Xerox machine, just only on regular paper, not glossy paper. Long end story, went like a charm. One left part. So anyway, he would respond now. He would hand me the little sheets of paper but it didn't end here. So on this test, I don't know if I got to tell this story because analysis synthesis also has an executive function piece on. So you're going along and you figured out how to deal with these logic problems, which he did. But then when you get to item 26, you have to switch it up. And so I'm always alert to, because your process that you've been using doesn't work anymore. And so I always watch to see what's going on. So he's sitting there and he's sitting there. And then suddenly he picks up my book and throws it across the room, hits the cement brick wall and shatters and breaks apart. And so I inferred that he was annoyed and angry with this thing because I'm a highly trained psychologist. We stopped. But then here's the point. I contacted the test publisher and told them what happened. And they said they'd send me a new one only if I sent the old one back, because they wanted to see why it failed. So if they could improve it in the future, they would. So I thought that was a pretty cool thing. But anyway, I share that story because it was like one thing after another until and that's what it is. The people who know these kids the most are the best, are the ones who are going to help you figure this thing out. And you got to stick with it. And that's just, so it's tough to get into. So anyway, when you have these materials, and I'm not sure how else to deal with them, because I thought we can talk about them in subsequent sessions as well. But the whole idea that by knowing what the demands are of the test, you can help the evaluator figure out which ones they might be able to use and which ones the youngster might be able to respond to. And it should be ongoing in nature. It takes time, it takes patience, and you got to stick with it with a bit. I just want to, so anyway, I'm not quite sure. So if you look at this, it just looks at these various tests and what the expectation is. If you have other tests that your evaluators are using on a regular basis, let me know and I can develop some sheets and we can have that for the next time that we get together. But this piece isn't gonna work out either. I want to share one more story just to show that sometimes you don't get any numbers from the evaluation, but just by doing it, you get to figure out what's going on. So it was a young gal. It was not Vermont. I became I was spending a lot of time traveling to New Jersey, working with, they have a advocacy agency down there to support kids who are being treated poorly. And this was a young girl who attended kindergarten in her classroom in a school walking distance from her home. When she went into first grade, the school told her parents she couldn't attend there anymore. She was being sent to a special school for kids with disabilities. And she had a thing called agenesis of the corpus callosum. And I don't know I had no idea what the hell that, well, I knew what it was. But how it affected kids. So what it is, the corpus callosum is a structure inside your brain that allows the right half to talk to the left half. And she didn't have one of those. And so she was a little unstable in her motor movements, delayed in her language, but otherwise, a smiley, happy little kid. So anyway, we decided that mom would come to Vermont with this little one, and they moved in for the weekend. And so I said, bring all her favorite toys. And Mary Ellen was a part of this as well. And we spent the weekend playing with this kid and getting to know that and just figuring out this amazing stuff. And I'll give you one. And so also this was before we had the interweb where we could find out about stuff. So I got in touch with the University of Maine in Orono has a place called the National Organization of Rare Disorders. I contacted them about agenesis of the corpus callosum, got information from them. They put me in contact with a parent of a young man with it, and I talked to them. And then found out just play stuff with this youngster where we found so much about it. So I'll just give you one example, and then I'll end the story with how it turned out. So if you remember from your biology days, the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, and the left side of your brain is involved with the right side of your body. And so what we found with this little gal is that if we put a ball, if she wasn't looking and I took her hand and put a ball in her hand and asked her to tell me what it was, she couldn't tell me what it was. Because the language side where that word was in the left side of her brain. If I took the ball and then stuck it in her left hand, what do you think happened? Ball. So anyway, we did all these different tests. I can remember she this. The other thing is sometimes you have to do unusual stuff to get kids to cooperate. She had this little fairy that you pulled the string and it would fly in the air. And anytime I pulled that, she would then work for like 5 or 10 minutes. Then she wanted the fairy going again. But anyway, it was just back and forth. But the point being, so then we get to the court hearing where they're being sued, and the parents are suing the schools so they can go to local school. And the psychologist from the district gets on the stage and hadn't done anything. I get on the stage and I got all these recommendations on the stand. I got all these recommendations on how to present material, blah, blah, blah. And the judge said, school hasn't done anything to support this kid. And anyway, she gets to stay in her school. The point of that is being that I had no test scores. We just did stuff and we learned about each other. I learned about her and then we wrote it up and off we went. So sometimes these evaluations of our most challenging students isn't about the numbers. It's about getting to know them and getting the information. Okay, how are we gonna provide instruction in a way that works for this youngster? Getting people to understand how this little gal's brain was working. Obviously, I'm not a neurologist, so the recommendation was that they get a neurological consult so they'd have more detailed information how to deal with this. Testing people at home where they're most comfortable is one of the big ones. The notion of make sure we have the right equipment. If the youngsters have certain seating equipment that they use while in school, that we're using that while we're working with them, things like slant boards, et cetera, being attuned to the lighting and the acoustics. A lot of times we're put in these cinder block rooms. Whenever I'm administering auditory tests to youngsters, nearly all tests provide a recorded version of it. And you can either have it on your smarter me phone or you have it on a little CD player, and have the youngsters with headphones on using that way. They're getting the information in both ears simultaneously, and we're also blocking out extraneous stimuli, and that's something to be in tune with. Something going on outside that's distracting, whatever. Okay, and being aware of potential interruptions. So some of the things we do. So, for example, those tests I was describing with that young person affected by autism through the book, those build on each other. That you're developing a strategy, and so if that got interrupted midpoint, that would be a tough one to join back in, because we would have interrupted the process of learning the task and then applying it to new items. So be aware of one of the things that I always do if I'm in a school doing an evaluation. I always check in with the administrative assistant and say, okay, what's happening today? Any drills? Any this? What's going on in the youngsters' routine that day that you don't want to interrupt? One of my worst experiences was I met with the classroom teacher in the morning, interviewed her. I said, okay, what's happening today? Is there anything that I got to be aware of? And she said, no, we're good. And so it was an old wooden school. We're in the room, we're working, and suddenly it sounds like there's elephants upstairs above us. And that's where the gym was. And I look up and this little second grade girl is crying. And I'm tearing my heart. I said, what's the matter? What's the matter? She says, that's my class. And they're in gym, and that's my favorite subject. Okay, off you go. So out the door she went, happy as a clam. But so being careful about that stuff. I always ask students, I ask them both ways. What do you not want to miss? And what do you want to miss? So it's because that's the when I'll schedule it. Okay, all right. So that whole scheduling stuff. You got to have a lot of breaks, particularly youngsters who take a lot of energy to generate speech. We have to take our time with that. Small sessions, frequent breaks. We got to be really flexible in what we're up to. Accommodating the personal rhythms of the youngster. I always ask, what's this guy like at the end of the day? What's this guy like? And typically, if people will frequently say, well, they tend to do better in the morning, and that's when I'm going to want to work with the youngster. I don't want to work with. I was working with a youngster last Monday, 8:30 in the morning, and after about 5 minutes, I said, we're done here. I mean, this kid was head down on the table, just exhausted. I found out that weekend he had 3 hockey games in 3 different parts of the state. Monday morning was not a time to be, so I had to suggest, I had to suspend that. I couldn't say, well, I'm here and I drove all this way. I wasn't going to get any good results. So I had to say, no, this ain't happening. We'll catch you later. All right. So these were some scenarios, but perhaps we'll get to those at another time if we figure out the technology. All right. So I just want to chat a bit about reporting out the evaluation results. First off, we got to take the parental perspective. I have been in meetings where there are up to 12 people around a table and mom. That is not that's an intimidating situation. I always sit next to the parent. If there's during these meetings, I sit next to the parents. I do have graphic representations of all the stuff I did so they can see them. So, all right. So first up, make sure we have the right scores for the right situation. So with parents, I always use standard scores and percentile ranks if appropriate. And I always explain what they are. Because 1 minute you're hearing a standard score of 50 and you're hearing, whoa, that's 4 standard deviations below the mean. And then you hear a percentile rank of 50 and you say, we're right on the average range. It's confusing for mom and dad. So try to stick to one score if you can, but if you can't, be sure that we're explaining each score before we use it. Okay. And certain scores are better at certain times. Always start by focusing on the strengths. And at this I'm probably speaking to the choir, but unfortunately, this is not a strength-based process in general. Where in terms of, suppose we're looking at eligibility, we're looking for what's going wrong. So we have to turn this into a strength-based process where, okay, here are things that are going well, and we focus on those and how we're going to use those. Then we're going to describe the challenges. Okay, this is what's going awry. Here's what we're going to do to deal with that. Always avoid jargon, but if you have to use a technical word, be sure that we explain it. One of the most, I went to one of the most important takeaways I've ever had from a national conference I went to was I went to listen to the president of the National Association of Learning Disabilities. It's a parent group, and he happened to be an attorney. No surprise there, I guess. But anyway, one of the things he said was that in nearly all cases where he's working with families that are at loggerheads with the school, it's because the family left the meeting, the educational planning team meeting, not understanding or knowing what was going on. And so we can avoid that by being as clear as possible. And that's not, I say that, but that's not the case in Vermont. I think we're pretty good at this. And I think we have pretty good relationships with most of our parents, but sometimes we run across a parent who's anxious, and sometimes that comes across in a hostile and not positive way. So the way to deal with that is just be as focused on the strengths and challenges and confident in what our results are, and get confident in what we're going to do to make things better. Okay. Bigot, how are we going to use this data? We've summarized how we're going to use the data to meet the individual's needs. Anytime you can make explicit links between test performance and real life implications. I think a common one that I get is a lot of times adults perceive. So, for example, here's a big one that always frequently pops up. A youngster with processing speed challenges is frequently characterized as being oppositional, non-compliant, and just kind of frustrating to deal with. And so when we can make the link between the fact that you just provided a 3-step direction to this youngster, he's got pretty good working memory, so I think he's going to hang on to it, but it's going to take him a while to process. Do not expect immediate response. And so that, conversely, if we find out that, boy, one of the challenges with this young person is their working memory, their short-term memory, and you give a 3-step response, don't expect 2 and 3 to make it, or one or two. They're going to focus on one aspect of that, and that's what you're going to get. The kid's not being oppositional. This is a real life link between what's going on cognitively and what's happening in real life. One of my favorite referrals was a referral for a youngster who, they suspected having ADHD, and so I did a class of observation. I didn't see anything that was indicative of ADHD. They also suspected he had a math learning disability, which is kind of unusual. I usually don't get that kind of. So anyway, we do the math assessments, and yes, he does have some challenges, but they're not huge. And during the interview, I spoke with the youngster, and I asked him what his favorite subjects are, and he told me, and one of them was math. I said, wait a minute here, I'm a little confused. Your math teacher told me that you're frequently off task, you don't finish your work during math, and she said you're doing pretty good except the area of math. And he says to me, well, math is right before lunch and I'm starving. How am I supposed to pay attention when I'm starving? So no ADHD, no math disability, hungry. So be cognizant. So we have to, she just needed snacks before. The result was snacks before. So from the mouths of babes.
Red,
yes.
this is just a really good segue, because Valerie, when you were talking about, the test setting and what you need to pay attention, she wrote, I always made sure the student had a snack and was not hungry.
I carry food. I have snacks with me. If you're in elementary school, I have a treasure chest. And I tell them my job is to help figure out how you learn best. I'm going to ask you to do some things that might be a little hard. Anyone who tries their best the whole time gets to pick from the treasure chest. It's got little Lego kits in there and all different things that people want. But anyway, that kind of little motivation, part of the environmental thing, where you're not hungry, and here's a little motivation to participate to you fully. And then lastly, in reporting out, be cognizant of your audience. We're going to be working with parents with varying levels of sophistication. So we need to be sure that we're communicating in a way that it's hitting the mark with whoever it is that we're sharing this information with. Okay. All right. This actually gives me a couple of minutes to talk about the New World Order. I don't want to leave us without talking about this. And so I just want to talk a bit about this cross-battery assessment and how it's something that has benefited low incidence populations, but also is going to benefit the broader student body as well. So if we look at the term specific learning disability, it says this is what's in the federal regs and also in our state regs. The term specific learning disability means a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes. Okay, so we have a disorder in one of the basic psychological processes that is involved in or contributes to or underlies understanding of language, spoken or written, which disorder may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, and do mathematical calculations. So the key part is basic psychological processes. And so that's going to become a catchword and something that we're all going to need to be familiar with, because in the New World Order, which is similar to what we've been doing with low incidence populations, we have to identify a basic psychological process that's a deficit that is having a negative impact on their acquisition of the basic skills. Hopefully, we're also going to identify strengths. So patterns of strengths and weaknesses, where that comes in. So this is a research-based. This person, Don Flanagan, has been following the research and doing meta-analysis, so looking at a bunch of research and determining what are the psychological processes that affect our basic skills. So that's what this chart is. So if we look at basic reading, in order to be have good basic reading skills. The research suggests we have to have good memory skills, good processing ability, good auditory skills, and good language use. Okay, so this suggests that if we have deficits in any of these areas, that's going to impact our basic reading. It also suggests that if a youngster in the New World Order is referred because they're having basic reading challenges, we have to be sure that the educational planning team says, let's check memory. We don't have to do the whole shooting match if we don't want to. We said, let's check memory, processing, auditory, and language use, and see if that's which one of those might be contributing. And so this chart represents what Don Flanagan has found in the research to support the notion of the relationship between those basic psychological processes and that on the left-hand side, the basic skills that we address in school. So now, again, I have a hard time staying away from the Woodcock-Johnson, because one of the things about the publishers of that is that they're always staying ahead of what's going on with us. And they produce these tests for us in education. And so what happened was, the last time it was normed, they knew that so first let me say, if you're using the discrepancy model, where I test your cognitive ability and I test your achievement, and then I determine there's a difference there, a significant difference that suggests the existence of a learning disability, we know that that's not a great way to do it. However, if you're using the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive with the Woodcock-Johnson achievement to do that procedure, you're doing it in the most statistically sound way possible. Even though it's not the best way to do it, it's the most sound way to do it. So having said that, they now recognize that we're going in a different direction. And so the last time the Woodcock-Johnson was normed, what they did was they took, and so if you remember your statistics days and the whole notion of correlation, there are almost 8,000 kids in the norm sample for the Woodcock-Johnson. And what they did was they said, let's look at each basic skill area, and we'll see as the basic skill area goes up, what cognitive skills go up. So as the basics reading goes down, what cognitive skills goes down? Do you see what they're getting at? They're saying which cognitive skills contribute to, in this norm sample of real kids. So the first slide I showed you is theoretical, and based on some research, a lot of research actually. This one here is actual kids in a norm sample. And what they found out was that if you're looking at basic reading, if you have strong basic reading skills, you also had strong comprehension knowledge skills, strong short-term memory, cognitive processing speed, and auditory processing. Those four things contribute to your basic reading skills. If you had poor skills in these areas, or any of these combination of areas, you had poor basic reading skills. So in the New World Order of looking for psychological processes that affect reading, this puts us in a place where we can actually look within a norm sample and find out what's going on. So for example, if we're concerned about reading fluencies, a youngster, let's just look at reading comprehension. Things have been going pretty well, but boy, this youngster just doesn't get what they're reading. We're going to measure comprehension knowledge, fluid reasoning, cognitive processing speed, and auditory processing to see if there are challenges in those areas. If there are challenges in those areas, that's the New World Order says we're not looking for a discrepancy, we're looking for a match. So this tells me that when I measure the cognitive skills you need to be a good reader, you're deficit in those skills. Now I measure your reading and you're also deficit. That's indicative, and to me that makes more sense than the discrepancy model. That's indicative of a specific learning disability, and that's kind of at the underlying level of any RTI model and any strength or weakness model that you're going to look at. And so I gave you two charts. The first chart is, this is evidence-based from research compiled by this person. She's at a university in New York that works there, and she's been following this for quite a while. And then over here is the stuff that McGrew found when he actually looked at 8,000 real kids. He found that if you had poor written expression skills, you typically had poor comprehension knowledge, poor cognitive processing speed, poor auditory processing, and poor long-term too, which makes sense if you think about what you need to be a good writer. Conversely, if these were strong, you tended to be a strong writer. All righty? Okay. So in the New World Order, the questions are going to either got the discrepancy model is bye-bye. And we're going to have RTI, and we're going to have patterns of strengths and weaknesses, and perhaps some other. The federal legislature says an evidence-based approach. So there are other approaches out there, but these are the ones that we're hearing about in Vermont. So the evaluation questions by the EPT team are going to be quite different now. We're going to be asking our evaluation or psychologists to figure out, why isn't this youngster making, in an RTI model, why isn't this youngster making the gains in this basic skill area, in spite of the fact that they're getting high quality general ed instruction, they're getting high quality supplemental support services. We're using evidence-based programs and procedures to impart these new skills, where we're doing it with fidelity, integrity. We haven't cut anything out. We didn't like this part, so we're not going to do it. We're doing the program the way it was expected, but we're not getting the growth we would expect. That's what has to be answered now. Why isn't that happening? And the patterns of strength and weakness, we're going to have a similar situation, but now they're going to be specifically asking, what cognitive skills or cognitive processes are at play that are facilitating this youngster's. So that's a nice thing about pattern of strengths and weaknesses. They're facilitating their process, their performance. We're looking for skills too, strengths, not just weakness. And what cognitive or skills are contributing towards deficits, the weakness part. And that's the hallmark of a specific learning disability, is that you're not having trouble across the board for some unexpected, that's the in quotes, reason. You're having challenges in one or more of the basic skill areas. Okay, so again, the question is going to get posed differently. And having said that, we have about 10 minutes. Oh, so I included these slides at the end just to give more test names. These are, although I didn't address these in the test, in the actual text of our work, but these are tests that you might encounter that look at cognitive ability.